Hello, everyone. I'm Casey Blake. I'm director of the Center for American Studies, and it's my privilege to welcome you this evening. Thanks to everyone for coming. I want to thank in particular Angela Darling, the assistant director of the center, and her assistant Lakin King for everything they did to organize tonight's event. And I want to thank the Jack Miller Center for its financial support for tonight's lecture. With this lecture, we pay tribute to the life and legacy of our late colleague, Robert Ferguson. Robert was, of course, a giant in American literary studies and a pioneer in the field of law and literature. A master teacher and model mentor, he was also a great supporter of American studies at Columbia. Those of you who knew Robert or who have read his work know he was a man of deep learning and strong convictions. His erudition is evident on every page he wrote, indeed in every sentence he wrote. A quick perusal of the endnotes to his books reveals references to Aristotle, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Melville, John Cotton Dana, John Dewey, and many others. All this in addition to the legal decisions he parsed with a sharp analytical eye and made available to us as part of our shared history. And as the titles of his last two books, Inferno and Metamorphosis, make clear, Robert drew deeply on Dante and Ovid in his passionate indictment of American punishment. All of which is to say, Robert was a humanist who believed that the greatest crime we commit against the millions of women and men we keep in prisons is to violate their humanity. In recent days, I've had the pleasure of rereading some of Robert's work and have been struck once again by his remarkable gifts as a prose stylist. The precision of his language, the steady cadence and sturdy composition of his sentences reveal a man who knew Cicero as well as he did Lincoln. It goes without saying that Robert avoided fancy obscurantist academic jargon. More to the point, he did not write with the assumption that we, his readers, already agreed with him, or that his role as a scholar was to confirm our existing opinions, let alone inflate our sense of our moral superiority to those who lived before us. Instead, he wrote to persuade his readers, to draw us into a conversation about things that mattered. Really at stake, he wrote towards the end of his life, is how we want to think of ourselves with others. That's a sentence that deserves repetition. Really at stake is how we want to think of ourselves with others. As a scholar and teacher, Robert Ferguson practiced the civic arts, and for that and much else besides, we remain in his debt. And now I want to turn things over to my colleague, Michael Hindis, lecturer in American Studies and History, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Walter Benjamin, the German Jewish philosopher of history who committed suicide while fleeing the Nazis in 1940, wrote about his times that the, quote, emergency situation in which we live is the rule, unquote. Nearly 80 years later, Walter Benjamin's observation has never rung more true. Today, one of our most distinguished historians of law will discuss the history and context of presidential emergencies from Lincoln to Trump. Professor John Fabian Witt is uniquely qualified to lead us on such a journey. He is the Allen H. Duffy Class of 1960 Professor of Law at Yale University, as well as the Master of Davenport College. After earning his Bachelor of Law and PhD degrees at Yale, and following a clerkship at the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, he taught at Columbia before returning to Yale. He is the author of many prize-winning books, including Lincoln's Code, The Laws of War in American History, which won the Bancroft Prize among many other plaudits. In Lincoln's Code, Professor Witt showed how calculations of Enlightenment, natural law, and divine inspiration could be subsumed to the law of war and to the overriding legal objective of winning a war using all necessary means, meaning, quote, those measures which are indispensable for securing the ends of the war, unquote. And in Lincoln's Code, this meant implementing emancipation and enlisting freed slaves in the Union Army as a military necessity. Professor Witt has a book coming out by Yale University Press this summer, also titled To Save the Country. And he's working on another book, because why do only one thing at a time, called The Fund. So now, without further ado, Professor John Fabian Witt.
It's a real pleasure and an honor. I'm touched and delighted to be here with you today. Robert and Priscilla Ferguson were mentors of mine when I was here on the faculty at Columbia for 9 happy years. Robert took it upon himself to mentor junior faculty during the time that I was here. I remember quite clearly 2 occasions in particular. One was when I had a real back problem, and I promised Casey that I wouldn't tell this story. But I had a real back problem that was actually interfering with my work. And Robert gave me the name of a masseuse. And those of you who knew Robert know that he was a formal man, that boundaries and a certain distance was the way he carried himself professionally. And I think he was worried that he'd crossed the boundary there, that was too intimate. And he flushed a little, just a little, being Robert, and he said, no funny stuff, no funny stuff. So, more importantly, Robert was the one who told me it was time for me to talk in a faculty meeting. As a junior faculty member, one doesn't know when one's allowed to talk. And Robert came to me one day, he closed the door, and he said, now is the time, you should talk. I don't think I had anything to say for that faculty meeting, but that didn't matter. And I think colleagues ever since have regretted that Robert started me talking because I haven't shut up yet. Priscilla welcomed me into their home. We talked about upstate New York, the beloved Gloversville, where Robert and Priscilla would spend summers, where Priscilla grew up, I think. Robert was a scholarly inspiration for me in any number of ways. His 1984 Law and Letters in American Culture is a model for me of how scholarship can be brilliant and elegant at once, a craft, an art, and that beauty can be involved in the production of scholarly work. Robert had other modes too, not just beauty, but as Casey said, passion. I think not only did he help me as a young scholar, I think he also provides me with a vision of how to age as a scholar. Inferno, the last book he published in his lifetime, is a searing critique, as Casey said, of the American prison system, what he called a peculiar version of hell, one made just for America. And in his final years as a scholar, Robert was on the early edge of a critique that's only grown stronger in the years since, a critique of incarceration. His critique was pitched as much to the incarcerated as it was to the usual more fortunate readers of scholarly work. And to me, Inferno stands, among many other things, for the possibility that mature scholars can develop new passions and channel them into brilliant and vital work. Now, I'm not quite ready yet to write a last book, knock on wood, but it is certainly true that there have been many passionate reactions to the President of the United States' emergency proclamation of February 15th this year. And so what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the emergency declaration of February 15th, its aftermath, set it in historical context, and try to bring those two things together. I should say thank you, especially to Angela and Lakin for setting this all up, to Michael for such a wonderful introduction, and Alan for presiding, and Casey for presiding over this event. Citing border security and a long-standing problem of large-scale unlawful migration, President Trump declared an emergency at the nation's southern border and authorized the military to undertake construction projects designed to address this supposed crisis on February 15th of this year, thus his signature policy, the wall. The president's February 15 declaration is part of a bigger story about emergencies in modern American law. Going back to 1976, when Congress sought to rein in presidential emergency powers by enacting the National Emergencies Act, which created a framework for authorizing and controlling emergency powers. The act provides that when congressional legislation authorizes special emergency powers for a president, that president may declare a national emergency to invoke such powers. But the act creates a framework of 6-month review of any such declaration by Congress and authorizes Congress to reverse such declarations by concurrent resolutions in the House and the Senate without the signature of the president. Now, since 1976, Congress has, according to the Brennan Center, enacted 123 emergency powers for the president. Presidents, in turn, have declared some 60 emergencies, of which some 29 are still in effect today. The emergency powers arrangement of 1976 is most distinctive, though, for its now notorious collapse, or rather the now notorious collapse of its constraining features. Congress has never, not once to my knowledge, convened one of the 6-month reviews contemplated by the Act. And in 1983, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a case called INS against Chadha, struck down as unconstitutional the kind of arrangement that Congress had adopted for overriding the president's declarations in the National Emergencies Act. After Chadha, congressional override can take place only by a joint resolution of the Congress, which means it's subject to veto by the president, which may in turn only be overturned by a vote of 2/3 of each chamber of the Congress. And this, of course, is precisely what's happened in the past month. On March 14th, the Congress voted decisively to reject the president's emergency declaration. The next day, President Trump vetoed the joint resolution, and on Tuesday of this week, just 2 days ago, the House of Representatives failed, as expected, to muster the 2/3 required to overturn the veto. So this week, the National Emergency Act's constraining structure lies in ruins. Those ruins give us a vantage on a powerful and worrisome interpretation of the emergency problem, one that surges back into view this week, I think. In this view, emergencies are a dangerous departure from liberal democratic norms, with a grave risk of collapse into tyranny, much as history witnessed in Weimar Germany between the two world wars. What I want to do here today is talk about a recessive perspective from American history, one that offers a very different, I think, perspective on the emergency problem. In particular, I want to talk about the problem of emergencies in a slave society. That's, of course, what the United States was for the first nearly a century after its founding. And I'll describe for you the rediscovery of a lost manuscript that arose out of the slave society's encounter with the emergency problem, and I will, in the end, try to connect it back to the 21st century and the current politics of emergency. There's a funny thing about the usual liberal anxieties about emergencies. From their beginnings, liberal orders have been built around security imperatives, even security crises. Ira Katznelson, here today, came to New Haven to deliver the Stimson Lectures just a few weeks ago and emphasized the way in which the liberal tradition, the liberal social contract tradition, arises out of solutions to background security emergencies. Scholars in what I might think of as the Yale-Columbia or Columbia-Yale School of National Security Constitutionalism. I'm thinking of people who are on the New Haven Morningside Heights circuit like Akhil Amar, Philip Bobbitt, Matt Waxman, powerfully describe the U.S. Constitution as a security arrangement in a world of grave dangers. One political scientist calls the U.S. Constitution a peace pact. Indeed, on some accounts, the constitutional nation-state itself, in its essence, is a peculiarly successful security arrangement, one whose most distinctive features is its capacity to raise resources in the struggle for survival. Now, to be sure, the United States Constitution, the federal Constitution, has few explicit emergency provisions itself. The literature on emergencies focuses on the absence from the federal Constitution of anything remotely resembling the Roman dictatorship system of temporarily built-in executive authority. Now, this is, I think, at least in part because of the kinds of emergencies and the kinds of sudden exigencies about which powerful actors in American politics were concerned during the early republic. The kinds of exigencies with which they were concerned were very different from the ones about which we have worried for the past century and a half. And at the heart of the emergency risk for the first generations of American politics was a threat distinctive to being a slave society, the threat of slave insurrection. An emergency debate took place in the first century of the American Republic that was principally about slavery and its politics. And if we bring this debate back in, the politics of emergency reverse themselves in complex and interesting ways. So here's the big reversal of emergencies in a slave society. Starts in 1775, when Lord Dunmore, the last royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation freeing slaves of rebellious Virginians. Now already you can see the reversal. The emergency power is freeing the slaves, and that's at the heart of the story that I want to tell today. Planters reacted in horror and outrage, worried that enslaved persons in the American South might rise up. The next year, Jefferson's declaration condemned the king for having excited domestic insurrections amongst us, a thinly veiled reference to the despised Dunmore. The Haitian Revolution and its aftermath in the 1790s, especially the stories about the Haitian Revolution that planters tell themselves, produced still more fear of bloody uprisings among the enslaver class. And the War of 1812 touches off yet another round of the same. The controversy over slave uprising emergencies was not exclusively a one-way conversation. Slaves had their say too. We have too few of their recorded voices, but their agency and their determination produced white fantasies about uprisings. Such white fears, as historians like Columbia's Barbara Fields have noted for some time now, gave the lie to infantilizing myths about slave inferiority and are powerful evidence of resilience and resistance. Anti-slavery whites also had their say, and beginning in the 1830s, an aging John Quincy Adams took to the floor of the House of Representatives to make a startling argument about Congress and slavery, an argument that inaugurated a now forgotten early debate about emergency powers in American constitutionalism. The country's political leaders in the 1830s virtually all agreed that the federal government lacked the power to reach slavery in the states. Adams had catered to such ideas back when he was running for president and needed Southern votes, and when he was president. But in 1836, Adams gave voice to a startling and dissenting view, articulating an idea that charted a path to the Emancipation Proclamation still a quarter century away. The Constitution, Adams conceded, might protect slavery in peacetime, but in wartime, he asserted, the Congress could interfere with slavery. Congress could even abolish slavery. Adams's words, "From the instant that your slave-holding states become the theater of war, civil, servile, or foreign, from that instant the war powers of Congress extend to interference with the institution of slavery." In a wartime emergency, Adams later explained, Congress would have complete, unlimited control over the whole subject of slavery, even to the emancipation of all the slaves. During the gag rule controversies of the 1840s over anti-slavery speech on the House floor, Adams repeated the idea again. If Congress could repeal slavery in the event of war, he reasoned, then Congress could hardly forbid debate on the subject of slavery. In the event of foreign invasion, for example, the laws of war authorized martial law. All the, now Adams's language again, laws and municipal institutions would be swept by the board, and the martial law that took their place would authorize the federal government, if necessary, to emancipate the slaves. It was, Adams explained with extraordinary clarity and stunning foresight, in the very nature of things. This is the 1840s, mind you. In the very nature of things that the southern and southwestern states would one day be the Flanders of these complicated wars, the battlefield upon which the last great conflict must be fought between slavery and emancipation. Unsurprisingly, Southern planters rejected Adams's subversive views. Samuel Smith Nicholas, a lawyer and judge of Kentucky, issued the most extensive response to Adams. In an 1842 pamphlet written under the pseudonym Kentuckian, Nicholas took on the elder statesman Adams. "I have not the language to express the surprise, not to say horror," Nicholas wrote, "with which I have witnessed the promulgation of these opinions. Adams's ideas to him were sheer madness. It was outrageous," he asserted, "to suggest that a foreign invader could create a situation under which either the invader or the United States would be able to do what Congress in peacetime could not do. To think otherwise," Nicholas continued, "would be to give a leader in wartime the power to strike dead in the hands of its owners 400 millions worth of property, and to do so by mere proclamation." Now, strike dead is a striking phrase. Nicholas envisioned a kind of genocide in this line. Freedom was apparently beyond his capacity to even imagine, though Adams was speaking only about emancipation. In Nicholas's view, the Constitution had created a republic organized around a set of core principles that Adams seemed to have forgotten in what Nicholas called his zeal for his black fellow citizens. What Adams proposed, Nicholas objected, would entail nothing short of a complete transformation of the basic identity of the republic. Indeed, Nicholas worried that such a transformation might radically invert the basic structure of American life. Adams's ideas about martial law, he asserted, would inevitably lead to the enslaving of his white fellow citizens. Now, Nicholas's multiple nightmare fantasies were hallucinations, though they have echoes, I think, in today's alt-right and neo-Nazi fears about race war and the racial composition of the United States today. Yet Kentuckian's argument also carried an idea that runs through critiques of emergency powers in constitutional democracies. To destroy slavery, he insisted, would be to destroy the United States. The Republic, he said, wasn't merely an aggregation of individuals, it was a collection of values. It was organized around a set of constitutive commitments, one of which, in his view, was the protection of slavery. Nicholas believed that altering this constitutional commitment wouldn't rescue the Republic, even in a crisis. To the contrary, abolishing slavery would destroy it, as he saw it, or at least transform it into something other than it had been before. The identity of the United States would not survive a martial law that destroyed slavery, or so he contended. In making this argument, Nicholas drew on a long tradition of Anglo-American hostility to martial law, rooted in 18th century English legal authorities like Sir Matthew Hale and William Blackstone. The common law tradition of Hale and Blackstone soon became an American tradition and a slave society tradition. For a half century and more, slave-owning Southerners and their heirs would insist that the core commitments of Anglo-American constitutionalism were deeply opposed to martial law and a broad emergency authority. In the 1830s and 1840s, their efforts would hold off abolitionist petitions in the Congress. In early 1850, as controversy over the admission of California and a new fugitive slave law raged in Congress, a senator named Jefferson Davis from Mississippi condemned the notion that the President of the United States could decree that slavery was abolished by virtue of the powers he held under martial law. "Does anybody believe," Davis asked, "that it would be submitted to?" The Civil War's controversies over government power reenacted the basic outlines of the Adams-Kentuckian debate. Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus called forth the argument that the executive necessarily possessed a suspension power because no constitutional arrangement could strip a state of its authority to protect itself. At Fortress Monroe in Virginia in May 1861, it was the law of war that empowered General Benjamin Butler to give shelter to black women and men escaping from the Confederacy. The Confiscation Acts of 1861 and 1862, which purported to free certain slaves in the South, proceeded on a theory of congressional war power. The Emancipation Proclamation did too, shifting to executive power, and on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the proclamation as, his words, "an act of justice warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity." Emancipation, in turn, precipitated a hurried reprinting of the old Kentuckian pamphlet, this time arrayed against abolitionists like Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner on the other side. Now, we're now, I think, in a position to rethink things like the famous Civil War case of Ex parte Milligan, long a staple of the emergency canon in American constitutional law. The Milligan case involved Indiana resident Lambden Milligan, a wartime leader of the notorious pro-Confederate organization the Sons of Liberty. In 1864, Union authorities captured him and charged him in a military commission in Indiana with attempting to deliver guns to Confederate prisoners in prison camps near Chicago and along the shores of Lake Erie. Milligan had tried to do this while dressed as a civilian, wearing none of the formal insignia of a privileged combatant. His conduct constituted a law of war offense, which ordinarily might have sufficed to sustain the jurisdiction of a military commission. But the Union declined to press the law of war basis for the commission's jurisdiction, its authority, its power. Instead, lawyers for the United States aimed to get a ruling that would permit the continued use of commissions to maintain order in the South as the war came to a close. In this, they failed. In the Milligan decision, which the Supreme Court announced on April 3, 1866, one day after President Andrew Johnson had declared the war over, the Supreme Court ruled Milligan's conviction by military commission to be unconstitutional. The Milligan opinion, which followed the court's decision by some 8 months, applied hard and fast constraints to the power of military necessity. Justice David Davis, writing for the court, said that the war power could never be applied in instances where the courts were open and their processes unobstructed. Now, since Reconstruction, civil libertarians have celebrated Milligan as marking the restoration of civil liberty after the war's end, and there's much to be said for this view. Milligan became a case during the 9/11 military commissions that really surged back into view for civil libertarians today. But few have paid much attention to the decision's terrible downsides when it was decided. Milligan and a sequence of decisions that followed badly undermined the power of the federal government to deliver on the promises of emancipation. In cutting back the jurisdiction of military commissions, courts revived the legacy of Samuel Smith Nicholas, whose Kentuckian essays from 1842 also took the libertarian position on emergencies. Just as in 1842, and here I think is the notable thing, the libertarian critique of emergency powers intervened on behalf of powerful whites at the expense of African Americans, first as slaves and then as free people. Liberty figured as a procedural obstacle to justice. Emergencies since have regularly echoed the dynamics of emergencies in a slave society. Arguments against federal military authority that began in the defense of slavery would show up in the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, limiting federal military authority in southern states. They would appear in the white South's opposition to federal voting rights bills and anti-lynching bills. They featured in the infamous riot against black soldiers stationed in Houston during World War I, and then again in the massive resistance to the 101st Airborne Division's deployment to desegregate Little Rock, Arkansas's Central High School in 1957. In episode after episode, the regime of white supremacy has sought shelter in the traditions of Anglo-American liberty. If only, one might be tempted to think, if only there'd been someone, a theorist of emergencies on the ground during the antebellum years and the Civil War and Reconstruction, someone who might have synthesized the lessons of the constitutional controversies of a slave society into a theory of emergencies in a liberal constitutional order. And until now, the main models available have been Justice Davis's rigidly constraining Milligan opinion on the one hand, and a ferocious jurisprudence of terror coming out of the British Empire on the other. But there was a different model, hinted at in Chief Justice Salmon Chase's concurring opinion in Milligan, yet for the most part lost for more than a century. A theory that drew on Civil War precedents and on the history of Anglo-American emergencies to develop an idea of how emergency might work in a liberal constitutional democracy. Its author was a fascinating and complex Columbia figure, a political scientist here at Columbia named Francis Lieber. Lieber was born in Berlin in 1798. He battled Napoleon in the Waterloo campaign of 1815, where he was wounded in the neck and left for dead. And eventually he made his way to the United States, arriving in 1827, where he became a prominent publicist and political theorist, a professor at the College of South Carolina for 20 years, and then here at Columbia College in New York, starting in the mid-1850s. The winter of 1861-62 saw Lieber delivering a series of lectures in the laws of war at Columbia, which was then downtown. The New York Times published the lectures as they came out. There is a Times reporter here, I'm sure, covering these lectures in just the same way that those lectures were covered then. And they caught the attention of the Lincoln administration. Lieber's ideas were appealing to Lincoln's inner circle because they offered a path that was lawful but uncompromising, legal but fierce. Lieber celebrated what he saw as the morally rejuvenating capacity of wartime. He urged an aggressive war strategy in the Civil War in particular. Strike, strike, strike was language that he put at the top of virtually every letter he wrote in 1861 and 62, worrying that efforts to conciliate rebels had led the Union to keep the gloves on. He criticized humanitarian lawyers as, in his words, namby-pambies. I had not known that that phrase went back as far as it apparently does. And Lieber was a law skeptic, at least in certain respects. Even before his Columbia lectures, Lieber asserted that nations in utmost need are never saved by legal formulas. If the fundamental law of a nation omits to provide for these exceptional cases, Lieber warned his readers, the nation's leaders would inevitably seize the powers necessary to answer the crisis. Power will be arrogated, he concluded, as people arrogate power in the case of a shipwreck. Late in the summer of 1862, as Lincoln moved decisively toward a harder strategy in the Civil War, the fierce outlook advocated by Lieber became still more useful to the Union. On September 22nd, after the bloody stalemate of Antietam, Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation, promising to emancipate slaves in rebel states on January 1st. The coming of emancipation, in turn, prompted the Lincoln administration to revisit the laws of war and to defend the proclamation's legality. Lincoln's general-in-chief, Henry Halleck, commissioned Lieber to draft a code restating the basic laws of armed conflict. The code that Lieber produced, and which is well known, took up and defended the Adams-Sumner-Lincoln position on slavery in the laws of war. Military necessity, as understood by modern civilized nations, Lieber wrote, consists in the necessity of those measures which are indispensable for securing the ends of the war. Such measures included the authority to free enemy slaves, and it went much further. The war power, Lieber asserted, was nothing less than the power to rise to the occasion, whatever that occasion might be. To save the country, Lieber wrote most starkly, is paramount to all other considerations. Now, for more than a century, scholars have known that Lieber wrote a manuscript about emergency constitutionalism after the war ended, a manuscript that was designed to defend the work that he and Lincoln's cabinet had done during the war. He wrote about the manuscript in his correspondence, fragments were published, and when Lieber died unexpectedly, the manuscript went missing. It is not to be found in the papers of Lieber's family, deposited at the Huntington Library in California. It doesn't appear in the Lieber manuscripts at Johns Hopkins, and it doesn't turn up in the Judge Advocate General's collection of Lieber books, now at the Library of Congress. In the course of research on Lieber, however, I found the manuscript. I stumbled across it, buried deep in the official archives of his son, a man named Guido Norman Lieber, who served as Judge Advocate General of the United States in the closing years of the 19th century. The lost Lieber manuscript, as begun by Francis and developed by Norman, summarizes the fierce strand of Lieber thinking about constitutional emergencies, one rooted in controversies from the decades-long struggle that led to the Civil War and its aftermath. Its conception of emergency powers is striking and robust. In keeping with the Lieber's famously tough code for the laws of war, the manuscript on martial law and emergencies defends the Lincoln administration's most controversial assertions of power. It supports the suspensions of habeas corpus, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the use of military commissions. The Lieber manuscript's starting point is a distinction they draw between military law on the one hand and martial law on the other. The key difference between these two regimes, military law and martial law, was that military law was nothing more than the will of the sovereign set into rules for the armed forces. It's a law for the armed forces. Martial law, by contrast, was a law of self-preservation, governed by an external standard, the principle of necessity. Martial law, the Liebers explained, was the law of necessity from the laws of war, drawn from the laws of war, but this time applied at home. Necessity offered vast powers, of course. The duty of self-preservation, the Liebers said in their manuscript, was a principle inherent in all politics, akin to the right of self-defense for individuals. As the Liebers saw it, the law of necessity can be limited neither by statute nor by judicial action. Even if the Constitution had aimed to prevent the exercise of the necessity power, even if the Constitution had built-in limits on the necessity authority, such constraints would be ineffective. The necessity power would exist nonetheless, they concluded, for the law of necessity cannot be controlled, their words. A right, no, a duty of self-preservation was an inalienable feature of what it was to be a state in a world of states. Uncontrollable, though, didn't mean limitless, and we'll return to this point shortly. For now, we can see the character of the Liebers' necessity power by focusing on the critique they offered of the Milligan decision. The court in Milligan, as you'll recall, purported to prohibit forms of martial rule when the courts are open to all persons. They were borrowing from Sir Matthew Hale, who talks about the king's courts. The Liebers insisted that the inherent emergency power of self-defense could not be constrained within territorial limits. If martial law proper is a law of necessity, the Liebers contended, its jurisdiction must extend wherever the necessity exists. The fact that courts were open or not might serve as evidence of the extent to which there was an emergency, but the fact of courts being open or not could not take the place of the underlying determination itself. Necessity was the ultimate and only question. Now compare this with the view of sovereign authority posited by a theorist of emergencies like Carl Schmitt, the Weimar era and Nazi jurist, whose writing on emergency powers has been as influential as it's been controversial. Schmitt imagines that the will of the sovereign is unbounded. Indeed, this very unboundedness is the core of what it means to be a sovereign in a moment of exception on his account. For the Liebers, by contrast, necessity is not only a license for action, it is also its own constraint. Necessity licenses only those courses of conduct that are warranted by the necessity which is looked to for their justification. Now, looked at this way, the Liebers were able to identify any number of historical episodes of undue force not warranted by the necessity power. That is to say, they were able to find and identify things in history that would have been ruled out had the necessity standard been applied. They listed the fatal flogging of British soldiers in colonial Senegal in 1782, the military tribunals after the end of a slave rebellion in Demerara on the coast of South America in 1823, executions after unrest in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, in 1848, the execution of an opposition leader in Jamaica in 1865. In the United States, the Liebers held that necessity would not have warranted military tribunal prosecutions for treason of the Confederate leadership. The Constitution, they pointed out, required the courts for such charges. And even if necessity could have overridden such provisions, they observed, the civil courts had been available to hear such charges, and there hadn't been any such necessity to avoid them. The Liebers understood full well that moments of necessity were junctures of radical instability. To decide on the steps to be taken in a moment of crisis requires a definition of the thing to be rescued. The proposition that tactic A is necessary to rescue Project X, tactic A necessary to rescue Project X, is true if X is such that A is indeed necessary. In this sense, a necessity standard alone is circular and begs the question of the character of the relevant underlying project. In the necessity analysis, it's the content of the thing to be protected, the identity of the thing to be protected, not the necessity test per se, that is doing virtually all the analytic work. Now, it's at this stage in the argument that the Liebers make what I think is their most interesting analytic move in the manuscript. Their account offered an idea about necessity that did not appear in the 1863 code. As the Liebers put it, the way to determine whether an act was permitted under martial law's necessity standard was to ask whether, now their language, reason and common sense must approve the particular act in question. The acts of officials in moments of crisis, the Liebers wrote, their language, should be adjudged to be necessary in the judgment of a moderate and reasonable man. A moderate and reasonable man. In 1863, the elder Lieber's Code had offered precious few resources for evaluating whether some course of conduct was self-preservation or suicide. This, of course, had been Nicholas's question in the Kentuckian essays of the 1840s. The Lieber Code didn't provide an answer, but the Lieber manuscript on martial law did. Here's an example. The torture example explains what the standard of a reasonable and moderate man accomplished for the Liebers in their post-Civil War manuscript. Why had the Lieber Code of 1863 excluded torture as a means to save the country, even while insisting that saving the country was above all other considerations, paramount to all other considerations? How could these two ideas exist, an anti-torture norm on the one hand and a ferocious necessity warrant on the other? The Liebers identified limits on the means that necessity might warrant because, and I think only because, they believed the Republic to be constituted around an identifiable set of values, values that together formed a standard of temperate reasonableness. For Schmidt, the sovereign dictator exercised a kind of radical power in the moment of exception precisely because the moment offered an opportunity to reinvent the identity of the state. But for the Liebers, the ends of the Republic were limited. They were constrained by the public values of the regime embodied in the perspective of the moderate and reasonable citizen. Now, truth be told, there is precious little elaboration on the reasonableness principle in the Liebers manuscript. The book was unfinished and partial, but there is a deep and important point embedded in this fragment of their text. The point is that there is no moment of sovereign dictatorship. No one chooses in an act of pure will from outside the institutions and practices and norms of the social formations in which she is embedded. Even the moment of crisis is saturated by a system of norms and principles. The basic logic of the Republic travels into the moment of crisis and exerts influence over events. And as the Liebers saw it, the carrier of that logic was the basic values and constitutive commitments of the Republic, commitments whose basic character define the scope of what is reasonably necessary under even the most difficult of circumstances. So we are now, as I got more and more abstract and more historical, a long way from February 15th of 2019, or from the failed effort just earlier this week to overturn the president's veto of the Congress's override effort. So what do we do with this history? How do we make sense of our moment in the 21st century? Well, for one thing, we may need to abandon a particular idea about the history of emergencies, that they have served exclusively or predominantly as pathways to tyranny. In U.S. history, at least, one of the most robust strands of resistance to federal emergency authority has been the white supremacist strand, from Nicholas in Kentucky to Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy to opponents of martial law in the Reconstruction South, and so on and so on. Federal emergency authority has been a source for some of the greatest triumphs of justice in American history, emancipation chief among them. But of course, emergencies are dangerous too. We put constitutional processes in place for a reason. We disagree over our politics. An authority to impose particular conceptions of that politics outside of the constitutionally authorized processes poses grave risks to our political order. Does the Lieber prescription, coming at the end of the United States' long engagement with the politics of emergency in a slave society, have anything to tell us about how to distinguish between the heroic forms of emergency authority on the one hand and the dangerous forms on the other? Does the idea of reason-bound necessity hold lessons for our present dilemmas? Well, I'd like to think that it does. On the one hand, the Liebers respected the project of saving the country. They didn't purport to deny that executives ought to have emergency authorities to take urgent steps. How could they, coming out of the experience of the Civil War? They fiercely resisted rigid and inflexible limits like the one set down in the Milligan majority opinion, and yet they also insisted that necessity be limited by the basic norms of the community, the norms that defined and gave identity to the community in the first place. Now, one interesting dimension of the Lieber's approach is that they had some confidence in the capacity of courts to participate in upholding the basic norms of a community. The difficulty with Milligan, as they saw it, wasn't that courts made an after-the-fact judgment. The difficulty was that it imposed, the Milligan majority, imposed a rigid one-size-fits-all standard where no such straitjacket could plausibly succeed. Now, any number of observers in the last week have noted that after Tuesday's failed override, the action on the emergency wall, so-called emergency wall, will move to the courts. The courts today will rightly share the Lieber's concern with any awkward constraint on the executive's capacity. A better model would have been will be the Milligan case concurring opinion written by Chief Justice Salmon Chase and joined by 3 of his colleagues. Chase was in the Lincoln cabinet that approved emancipation. His opinion closely paralleled the elder Lieber's thinking at the time, and father and son drew on Chase in their manuscript. Congress, Chase noted, had not left the question of military commission prosecutions unaddressed. To the contrary, this is Chase's concurring opinion, Congress's 1863 habeas corpus legislation took up the question of how to handle people like Lambden Milligan who'd been arrested in the North. Congress had created a system in which those detained were to be reported to the local federal courts in a list and either prosecuted in those courts or released. The Lincoln administration, Chase noted, had not complied with that law. Milligan's name had not been sent to the federal courts. He had not been released when the grand jury there met without indicting him. It would have been an entirely different case, Chase said, if Congress had authorized Milligan's prosecution by a military commission. That would have been a prosecution under which Chase called, in language the Liebers adopted in their manuscript, martial law proper, which could either be, now Chase's language, called into action by Congress or temporarily, when the action of Congress cannot be invited, and in the case of justifying or excusing peril, by the president. Here was an approach to be emulated, as the Liebers saw it, and one that is worth pursuing today in the wall controversy. We should expect courts to be wary of second-guessing the merits of presidential declarations of emergency, even when the emergency seems to be a sham. Generations of lawyering in the national security state have taught lawyers to see the vast institutional advantages of the executive over the courts in evaluating national security risks. Second-guessing in such circumstances would risk the same mistake Justice Davis made in his opinion for the Milligan majority. It would inevitably lead to error, even if it might be correct from time to time. But the Chase opinion offers a different path, one that respects the basic reason of the American constitutional order. What is the kind of emergency for which Congress created the enabling legislation of the 1976 National Emergencies Act? It's a situation that requires action immediately and without delay. Chief Justice Chase described it, this is 1866, mind you, as arising in time when the public danger requires its exercise. When temporal considerations don't require fast action, Chase's opinion implied that there can be no emergency warranting the unilateral executive creation of military jurisdiction. Congressional approval is required under such circumstances, and congressional action contrary to military authority is doubly fatal. So here's a limit on the executive's emergency authority that's flexible, not rigid. Chase and the Liebers accommodated the imperatives of fast action outside the ordinary processes while not establishing a gaping exception in the basic law of the land. Chase rested his approach not on any substantive evaluation of the president's judgment about whether there was or was not an emergency, but instead on an institutional allocation of decision-making authority, in accord with what the Liebers called the basic norms and public reason of a system that makes Congress the lawmaker and the president the law enforcer. Now, such an approach is available to the courts today, I think. President Trump's order makes no effort to describe the situation on the southern border as a crisis evading Congress's authority because of exigent circumstances. It describes a long-standing, to use language from the order, and large-scale problem of a contested, to be sure, but familiar kind, one that's been going on for some time. The February 15th order offers no rationale for why Congress could not deal with the problem at issue. The inescapable conclusion is that this is policymaking to build a wall in the face of Congress's considered decision to do no such thing. To be sure, Congress has created an emergency exception to that decision, but such an exception can only be invoked in an emergency, and the public law materials from the Civil War and the Liber Manuscript offer a mechanism for distinguishing emergencies from non-emergencies, one that doesn't rest on the court's independent say-so, its after-the-fact second-guessing, but instead on Congress's deliberate decision. Now, what has history added to the analysis here? What value does the history have? Well, the history, I think, helps us see the value and respect for the emergency power of the executive. That emergency power brought us emancipation. It won't do simply to reject it as an execration on the American constitutional tradition. Heroes of our constitutional tradition championed it as the mechanism that would deliver the end of slavery. After emancipation, defenders of the free people appealed to it, often in vain, in an effort to deliver the kind of force that would be necessary to defend freedom and equality. We eschew it only at the cost of doing violence to admirable parts of our constitutional history and elevating parts of that history, like the Milligan majority, that have more complicated legacies than we have liked to admit. But a revisionist history of emergencies does not leave us without resources for thinking about emergency declarations in the here and now. To the contrary, the engagement with emergencies in a slave society offers a lesson in protecting and rescuing the basic reason of the Republic, a lesson in how to save the country. Thank you for listening.
I'm sure Professor Witt would entertain questions.
I will entertain questions, yeah.
I think we're going to ask people who are asking questions to make use of this microphone.
You and then I don't forget.
Yes, sir. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Hey, I got this.
9/10 of the law.
Yeah, exactly, possession. I wanted to ask about the 1840s arguments by John Quincy Adams that the government, that the executive has the right to, if necessary, emancipate slaves or end slavery. Was he speaking at that time about, was he thinking directly about a civil war? Was he anticipating the Civil War and talking about ending slavery as a punitive action against the slave-holding states? Or was he thinking partially or at all about emancipating the slaves in order to conscript them into service against a foreign adversary? Was that any part of it?
I think it's the latter rather than the former. That is, he's thinking about a foreign adversary, and really he's thinking about the implications of a foreign adversary for what the American constitutional order must be. It can't be that the American constitutional order has disabled the Congress from responding to a foreign adversary, therefore it must follow that Congress has certain power over slavery, goes the reasoning. One of the ways in which I think that was a live question was that European military strategists in the first half of the 19th century thought about what would happen in the event of war with the United States. And central to the strategy of winning such a war was lighting the tinderbox that was the American South. So that Adams wasn't making this up out of whole cloth. It's part of the United States' strategic deficit is to have a slave society. It's both an asset and a real risk in wartime.
Thanks very much. So, John, I found the reconstruction of the Lieber's necessity formula, as you have kind of illuminated it, is so compelling. The basic idea of which, if I understand correctly, is that those who implement the law have the authority to do what is necessary to preserve Project X, and then it is in our description and understanding of Project X, including legal norms that we value within Project X that tells us whether or not the action of the implementers is in fact necessary, is so compelling that it strikes me as it leaves one wondering why this would only apply in those conditions where we would say martial law should apply. The whole context of martial law and emergency seems almost like just a table setter for the wisdom of this approach to governance. And what I have in mind here is that formula that you've discovered in the Lieber's manuscript sounds a lot like contemporary proportionality jurisprudence as is practiced in much of the world outside of the United States to resolve a variety of questions ranging a spectrum from true military emergencies to workaday welfarist concerns. I mean, Israel is a clear example where this jurisprudence has maintained, has obtained a real pride of place, but we also see it throughout continental Europe and so on and so forth. So the thought then is, if that's right, if this is really a kind of through the crucible of war, just the discovery of an anti-formalist proportionality jurisprudence that will become the norm in the post-World War II West, I could see two takeaways. One, I could hear one camp saying, look at that, proportionality jurisprudence as it's practiced outside the Anglo-American world is essentially equivalent to 19th century martial law. We don't want anything to do with those legal cultures. It is only in the Anglo-American world that we've preserved something more truly legal than that kind of random walk balancing analysis. The other take would be, oh, no. The Liebers got it right, and the developers of a broader proportionality jurisprudence got it right, and we should just go with that, regardless of whether we're in a time of martial or in a situation of martial or non-martial gravity. So I wonder if you think that's like a fair contemporary placement of the Liebers argument, and then, you don't have to decide between those two camps.
It's good. So yeah, I think it is fair. That is to say, so Jeremy Kessler is raising the question whether proportionality analysis as done by constitutional courts, so there's a bunch of different sites, but let's take the paradigmatic one, constitutional courts, interpreting constitutions or human rights instruments to review government action and asking a question about proportionality and trying to balance the contending goods at issue. The critique of the proportionality mechanism or the analysis in such constitutional courts is that it has no democratic warrant. It is because there is no way to actually proportion or balance the contending goods of liberty and security, they being the biggest apples and the biggest oranges one can find. The proportionality analysis on the critique from juristocracy or some such thing, is that proportionality analysis allows judges to become like Carl Schmitt's dictators, circumventing the democratic processes to impose their particular vision of what our politics should be in the form of judicial review of legislation or other government action. So I think they are parallel in that way. The Liebers, the elder Lieber, the younger Lieber is not a political theorist in a sense. The older Lieber, very suspicious of what he called government from afar, would have been, I think, suspicious of judicial review, and so tries to confine this necessity analysis, the instrumentally rational way of thinking about what's permitted, confine it to emergency situations, and otherwise run things through the ordinary democratic political processes, which are designed precisely to figure out how to balance between contending visions of what our politics should be.
Jonathan?
Thank you. So bringing you back to our contemporary issues, to what extent do you think the courts, when they review, as they inevitably will, the president's declaration, will they take into account his public statements? He said a number of times, I can do this now, I can do it later, but I really want the wall, so I'm going to do it now. Yeah. That's doesn't sound a lot like an emergency, but to what extent will the courts take those into account?
Well, one further is, you take account of his actions. That is, so much information we live in an information barrage, in case you haven't noticed it. And so the president's been playing golf during this particular emergency, right? So that Well, the travel ban case would suggest that the statements won't be taken into account. One of the interesting features of this particular emergency order, and I don't understand if this was I don't have any way of, I can't understand what goes on in the White House. But the travel ban order, either by inadvertence and foolishness or by intentional effort to provoke, describes the problem as long-standing. Why would it do that? Why would it do that? It is a way of announcing that it's not an emergency in the traditional form. So you don't have to go outside the four corners of the emergency order to figure out what he's saying on Twitter or what he's doing on the golf course. They've announced, we're going to do this even though it's not long-standing. Even though it is long-standing and it's not an immediate crisis. So I think, I'd like to think that provides a kind of a hook for the courts that won't require them to do something they really don't want to do, which is say it's not an emergency. Because they're not going to want to do that. They've been trained for generations to not do that. So, quick battery check. I could repeat the question back. Would that help?
Well, let me ask you.
Good.
I mean, aren't you turning Schmidt into a bit of a straw man?
Yeah. I mean, so he's useful as a foil here.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. I mean, the state of the exception, sovereign has the exception, or he who actually announces the exception. That's an abstraction that is, argued then to be part of a positive or a silent positive in the liberal system, no matter how liberal it is. Right? So I'd like to hear you elaborate beyond the straw man opposition as to exactly what it is that the Liebers do that Schmidt doesn't.
So I'm going to repeat back your question so that it's for the ages, because I think we haven't captured it, and I might change it to make it easier for me to answer. If you don't mind. And no one will know. So Anders Stephenson says, your Schmidt is your Carl Schmitt, my Carl Schmitt, is a straw man. What if we had a more subtle, thicker, and more interesting account of Schmidt? How would the story be different? And I'm actually going to push back a little bit. I don't think that's a straw man Schmidt. Here's how I understand Schmidt to develop his critique of the liberal rule of law. The idea is that in the application of a norm, there is a moment of discretion, a moment of free choice, inevitably, in the effort to apply the norm to the case. And that moment of choice is, in fact, free. The person doing that application, she could be a judge, she could be an executive, she could be a policeman on the beat. That moment of discretion is a moment that is not bound by law and can't be, because the law didn't have a determinate endpoint in the analysis. And that moment of free authority is unbounded by the law, and that's the moment of sovereign exception. It can exist in an emergency in Weimar Germany, or it could just exist in an ordinary contracts case in which the judge has to decide as between two moves that are available to her. And I think the Liebers deny the existence of that moment of freedom. Their claim is that the judge is herself constructed in a system of reason. She's operating not as someone outside the system, but someone inside the system, inevitably. Now, our current president seems about as outside the system as I could possibly imagine, but even he operates in a set of institutions and systems that have so far repeatedly constrained his capacity to do as much harm as he sometimes seems to want to do. So that's why I think I have Schmidt basically right. I think he is the caricature, and the Liebers see it differently.
Stephanie McCrane.
We're doing the without. Okay.
Oh.
Yes. One sort of in-shop historian's question about Lieber and he and his son. What year he and his son were working on this? The question about that is, I'm just really curious, given what you know about Lieber. Thank you. Is as I understand it, his use of military necessity in Lieber's code was the first time that standard was written down or ensconced in the international laws of war. And I'm wondering, after the war, when he's writing this reflection on what he had created, what is it that's prompting him? I mean, is he sobered by the results of his own standard, that military necessity is a fairly unbounded, as you explained, standard for what's allowed legitimately in war? So I'm curious about, like, it's not Milligan, right? That's not what he's worried about. So I'm curious about the context of that, and if it has anything to do with the fruits of his own earlier labor. And then the second thing is, maybe this is a really just uninformed and ignorant question, but given that given that Lieber and the laws, his code and emancipation is happening in the context of an obvious war. It's war, and the Emancipation Proclamation makes it clear that I take these acts and I claim these powers because of the threat to the nation in war. But declarations of emergency powers outside of the context of war, can we treat them as the same thing? Like, I'm a little bit confused in following the talk, and it might be just that I don't know about the law that undergirds the declaration of an emergency.
Great. So first on necessity and the Liebers and when they're producing this text and why. The text, as far as I can tell, it begins with Francis Lieber's jottings during the war, after 1863. He is something of a, well, he's a character, as you know, and something of a megalomaniac might sometimes is a description I've sometimes been tempted to use. He's convinced that we today will think of John Stuart Mill, Alexis de Tocqueville, and Francis Lieber as the three great political theorists of the 19th century. And it didn't quite work out for him in that way, although at Columbia we remember him, and I certainly have done my part to try to keep his memory and his work alive. So he is, from the very beginning of the order that gets issued in 1863 with his code, offering to write longer documents. Can I elaborate on this for you? And so many of his jottings end up in this mess that is the manuscript. So he starts in 1863, 1864, and then I think much of it is written as a response to Milligan. Because Milligan doesn't just end in 1866. It goes on through Ex parte McArdle and then Ex parte Yerger. These are the cases, the sequence of cases that follow as the Republican Reconstruction Congress tries to recreate military commissions to do the work of doing justice in the Reconstruction South, since Reconstruction courts, state courts, are a dubious way to go, and since Reconstruction federal courts are just overwhelmed with the work to do. So it is a response to Milligan, I think, in large part. And then Lieber dies in 1872 with the thing half done. And then the McArdle-Yerger sequence isn't done yet when he dies. I would also say that I don't know that the 63 code, I wouldn't call it the first time military necessity is invoked written down in the laws of armed conflict. I would say it's a throwback to an early modern approach, really to a medieval just war Catholic thought approach, in which the question about what you're allowed to do in war is simply a question of whether it advances a just war end. Is it necessary to advance a just war end? And the Enlightenment move is to try to stop asking whether the war is just or not. So the necessity idea constantly causes people to attend to the justice of the cause in question. And if your project is to not ask that question because everybody thinks they're on the just side, then you move away from the necessity standard. You just create a bunch of rules. Can't kill prisoners. Don't ask why you can't kill the prisoners. You just can't kill the prisoners. Can't shoot civilians. Why? Don't ask why. Just don't shoot the civilians. You create a set of rules. And that's the system he's pushing back against. And so the necessity standard is corrosive of all those rules, many of which are glorious humanitarian norms. That's why he's a little scary in that regard. Yeah.
Thanks, John, for this terrific lecture. My question concerns the two historical parts, the Adams part and then the Lieber piece. Why would we assume that the Lieber reasonable person standard would have sided with Adams in 1842 as opposed to the Kentuckian? Just a straightforward question. Don Fehrenbacher called this period the period of the slaveholding republic. Presumably, the majority of presidents in this period had owned slaves in the antebellum period. The majority of members of the court. I mean, we can go through many such indicators of the way in which the United States was a southern slaveholding nation. So the advocacy of emergency power to potentially end slavery would probably not have met the reasonable person test, though I took the implication of putting the two parts together, that it might have worked the other way.
Mm-hmm. This is a great question. It's even more difficult a question for me if you add that I think it's pretty certain that Lieber in the 1830s and 40s was in fact biographically taking position in exactly the position you described. That is, Lieber in the 1830s and 40s is living in South Carolina. He's a slave owner. He's waffling on the slavery thing. Sumner disowns him at some point because Sumner has decided that his erstwhile friend Lieber is too embedded in the slave regime. At the same time, Lieber's South Carolina colleagues are suspicious of him, and part of the reason he gets kicked out of South Carolina is suspicion that he's not properly compliant with the orthodoxy on slavery. So he has a middle position, but certainly in the 1830s and 40s, he's occupying a very traditional Anglo-American position on emergency powers. So his writings on the habeas corpus suspension question in the 1830s and 40s make it very clear that only Congress can suspend the writ of habeas corpus, precisely the opposite of the position he'll take come the Civil War, when he's one of the chief defenders of the Lincoln administration's suspensions that are unilateral suspensions without Congress's help. So the problem is deepened by the fact that Lieber himself, more or less, I think, would have said something on the order of, would have taken Nicholas's side. So I've thought about how to make sense of that. And I think maybe one of the things that happens is that by 1863, it's not the 1840s anymore. Things have happened. One last piece is, in the 1840s, it's of course hotly contested whether the Constitution is a pro-slavery or an anti-slavery document. Like that is an active struggle. And one way to think about the Republican victory in the 1860 election is as a kind of referendum on that question. So someone like Salmon Chase, who's going to become the Chief Justice and Secretary of Treasury during the course of the war, Chase's position in his career as a politician is to say the Constitution is an anti-slavery document, properly understood. Lincoln is going to move into that position during the course of the war. And so when the code comes out and when in 1863, and when this manuscript is being written shortly thereafter, I think it might well be that the public structure of the constitutional regime has shifted. And so it might well be that Lieber can take both the position he takes in the 1830s and 40s, and then again this new position, because the basic structure and logic of the regime is in flux. That's the thought.
Yeah, so let me echo Ira's thanks for a great talk, and maybe a little bit his question. I have two quick questions. One is sort of hypothetical and one factual. The hypothetical one is, do you think the action of the Japanese internment would meet this necessity reasonableness standard? And the factual one, to which I'm sure I should know the answer, is there any instance before now of the executive declaring an emergency and then the national legislature, which however dysfunctional it may be, is some kind of reflection of the prevailing view of what's reasonable, says no, there's no emergency and there's no necessity? Is there a precedent to that? And whether or not there is that fact likely to figure, you think, in the thinking of the courts?
That's great. So on the first, Japanese internment, what I tried to describe was an institutionally organized inquiry into whether or not there was there's an emergency. And one of the striking features about the Japanese internment is the way in which it's produced not out of the federal government in Washington, but rather out of state politicians in California. So the Federal Bureau of Investigation is convinced, J. Edgar Hoover is convinced that there's no need for for Japanese internment, and it's someone like Earl Warren who's helping to produce it, ironically. Now, Congress, as far as I know, is essentially silent on the question. Right? Congress is not weighing in on Japanese internment, to my knowledge. So that's it.
They passed a law after the executive order then authorized it.
Okay, so once Congress has passed the law ratifying the executive decision, then the test that I proposed here wouldn't give you any leverage for reversing it, right? That is the procedural, institutional test that I said here doesn't end it. If Congress is on board and the executive is on board,
Right,
then
but today Congress is not on board.
Well,
Even
that's
it's not a veto-proof majority, but they're not on board.
Right,
So what are the implications of that?
right. And so then your second question is what to do with this non-veto-proof majority against the emergency proclamation, and that might well play a role in the court's effort to analyze whether or not there's an emergency. I can't think of a precedent. In part, it's evidence of the absence of emergency that the usually feckless Congress is willing to say there isn't an emergency. That's kind of an extraordinary thing. Whether the courts want to rely on that, given that its constitutional status is it's unclear. I mean, I don't really know whether they'll rely on it. Yeah, good question though.
Okay, well, listen, please join me in thanking Professor Witt. It's a wonderful lecture.
Thank you, Professor.